It is Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Mountain Time. It's time for Slate's Wednesday Night Live. I am Josh Levin, national editor here at Slate, host of Slow Burn Season 4. And with me is the great Christopher Johnson, producer of Slow Burn. What's up, Christopher?
What's up, Josh? How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. So it's, a lot of things would have had to have gone differently for us to have been on a tour right now. We would be living in a different world um, if we were like out, maybe we would be out in DC tonight, maybe we'd be in New York, maybe we'd be in LA
Maybe
doing some
both.
sort of, well,
Maybe
maybe
both.
both, who knows? Um,
Amtrak.
but I've been thinking, Christopher,
Mm.
one of the things that we both thought a lot about is that this is a really dark story, the story of David Duke, the one we've been telling in this fourth season of Slow Burn. But the season 3 about Biggie and Tupac, that's a really dark story too. It's about these two beautiful artists who get murdered, cut down in the prime of their lives. And yet there's a way in which that story, there was a kind of like joy and a lightness to it at certain moments, and you could bring that to a live show like the show that you guys did that I went to in DC. It was fun, like, the music, the conversation, and being able to kind of revel in what these guys did, and also leave space to be sad about what happened to them.
Right.
But I've just been thinking, I don't know if we could have done a show like that about David Duke. And I don't know if I would have been comfortable as a performer, as somebody who is telling the story in a live setting, trying to make it, quote unquote, entertaining. Have you thought about that question and like how to, whether in the live show context or in any kind of context, about how to make a story like this that is so dark um, be kind of entertaining and making an audience enjoy it?
It's a good question. You know, when I was, as they say in the before times, when I was dreaming of
Yeah.
how this would be a live event, because we were we were coming fresh off of the season 3 tour, so my head was already kind of in the live version space, and we had a great time doing that. So I was thinking about what would a live season 4 look like, and of course I thought about going to New Orleans, um, and I didn't get a whole lot farther than that, but in my mind, New Orleans is a lot of fun. So of course, there's plenty of darkness and struggle there, but I imagine that there would be a way to bring in a kind of larger cultural context, and there may be a way to kind of talk about um, the sort of New Orleans as this kind of course, the story is about not just New Orleans, but Louisiana and the nation. Um, but I could imagine ways that we would be able to talk about New Orleans in some ways at the center of some of this and the different parishes, and maybe with doing some digging, find ways to talk about culture and art in that, and spin it off of the very David Duke focused version of this, that there may be a way to kind of New Orleans it up without leading into cliches. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I totally see what you're saying. And I think we both were drawn to this story not because we were interested in David Duke qua David Duke, but I
Right.
think whether we're thinking of ways to spin it off to talk about culture or whether spin it off to talk about the larger kind of political context, Duke is kind of maybe a tiny dot at the center of all of these different concentric circles. And we made a decision very early on in this process that Duke the man, Duke the person, was not necessarily going to be the focus for us. That we didn't, our goal wasn't to have people at the end of this season come away and be like, I know everything there is to know about David Duke. Um, what we wanted people to come away with was like, I understand the country, the state, and the place that would have allowed for this person and his movement to flourish. That's what interested me. I think that's what interested you as well. And so, yeah, I'm totally on board with the Christopher Johnson vision of the live show that will never happen.
Should we turn and start taking questions? What do you think?
Yeah, folks who are watching us now, please send us questions. We'd love to make you a part of this show. Actually, before we do that, though, Christopher, I have a little
Okay.
bit of show and tell.
Uh-oh.
Episode 6, the last episode of our series, it begins with a famous slogan from the governor's race. And the great Larry Powell, the historian, who was also a part of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism, he sent me this memento. So thank you to Larry for sending this.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow.
So this is one of the original Vote for the Crook, It's Important stickers. And then we've got a couple of different No Dukes variants here. But I thought that people might enjoy seeing this under glass. But like this is the bumper sticker that you would have seen in Louisiana, like on cars in the Maple Street Bookshop in New Orleans. You would have seen all over the place in October, November 1991.
Do you remember seeing any of those growing up in New Orleans?
I would love to tell you that I did. I mean, I definitely have that slogan imprinted on my brain, like so many people do, even people who didn't grow up in Louisiana. I just think it's like a thing that became the shorthand for that race, and for Edwin Edwards, obviously. But I don't have like a particular memory of seeing the sticker on like a Jeep or something. But I must have, because that slogan is just something that's stuck with me for 30 years.
I have a question for you. Um,
Yes.
just to get out in front of the line. Sorry, folks, but it just occurred to me: is there so in this series? It's a 6 episode series, and the episodes are
Don't forget the
they're
bi-week episode, Christopher.
right. Sorry, yes, no,
Seven
six
episodes.
plus the interlude. Um, and they're rich episodes. The episodes are rich and sort of chock full of characters and stories and information. Um, and I'm wondering, like, what we don't do, which I think was the right decision, is that we don't talk a whole lot about where your life intersects with. We do it a little bit, and I think we do it in the right places and sparingly. But I want to know more about that from you. I'm curious, if there's more that you have to say about how growing up in New Orleans and, again, like Louisiana, obviously, like growing up there, how you felt David Duke's presence, if not directly, the kind of being in the air, even if it was sort of through your parents or aunts and uncles, teachers, whatever. How was he around for you?
Yeah, so there was always a sense of being kind of belonging to this place that I grew up, um, because my family had been in Louisiana for so long, had been in New Orleans for so long. Also, just being a part of a pretty vibrant Jewish community in the city, going to a synagogue that my parents and my grandparents had gone to, having a lot of relationships with Jewish people, who are my parents and grandparents' friends that I grew up around, and so not really feeling particularly alienated on a day-to-day basis in any way. But then, whether it's going to Baton Rouge to go to an LSU football game, or whether it's just going to different kind of spaces in the state, sometimes in New Orleans, sometimes outside of New Orleans, and actually feeling like, oh, okay, in this space around these people in this climate, I do feel like my place here is a little bit more in question. Do I actually belong here? And there were moments that I felt like that are totally independent from the Duke phenomenon. But I remember that feeling the most acutely during the Duke years. And I don't know how your memory works. In mine, there are some moments that are indelible,
Sure.
um, different things that I saw, different things that I heard, different things that I experienced. But with Duke, I didn't really leave that much out in terms of specific memories from the show, even though there's not that much in the show. Um, it was seeing signs. It was going to Tiger Stadium and seeing Duke at the game and being freaked out by that. Um, and so the fact that I don't have that many specific memories of it, it's more a comment, I think, on how my memory works, as opposed to any kind of comment on the effect that it had on me, because it had a pretty deep and profound effect on me, both consciously and subconsciously. The feeling of potential alienation, of kind of the disquietude around all of that, and just this very early experience of feeling more kind of politically aware, and this knowledge that, oh, okay, actually politics and politicians could have a really intense effect on my life, on other people's lives, lived experiences. And
Mm-hmm.
so that, to me, it's more the feelings and the emotions
Mm-hmm.
that stuck with me, rather than um, the actual, like, the visual or the hearing something like that. That's kind of what stuck with me.
Is there a chance that those same members of your community, sort of the Jewish world that you were in, is there a chance that folks, and not just Jewish, but sort of folks in your world, um, tried to protect you from this or kept you from this stuff because it can be toxic? I guess you wouldn't know, but I'm wondering if your people were like that, where they would just kind of shelter you because it was enough to deal with.
I actually don't think that that's the case,
Okay.
because Anne Levy, who listeners of the series will know as the Holocaust survivor who confronted Duke at the state capitol at the Holocaust exhibit, told her story in episode 3, kind of it paired with the story of Beth Rickey. Um, she was somebody that was in my world and in my life, and had sort of come into her own as a Holocaust educator around that time. And so definitely grew up with the understanding of, like, what the Holocaust was and what had happened to um, ancestors of mine. And so I when you have an awareness of that, of, like, the kind of deepest and darkest um, you know depths of what people can do to each other, and, like, and what hate and bigotry can do. I don't know if there's, I don't know how much you can shelter someone who has
Mm-hmm.
that knowledge.
Mm, fair
So
point.
I think, um, to the extent that I was sheltered, I would say it was more just because I had kind of, like, childlike interests and concerns. Like, I was maybe not thinking about this all day, every day, because I was thinking about, like, school and sports and, what I like to watch on TV.
Right.
So I don't think, I wouldn't suspect that anything was hidden from me.
Okay.
But I'm going to turn the tables on you.
Yeah.
And we got a question about the kind of free speech issues, which I found really fascinating, and which I was glad we were able to get at in the second episode of the series, which starts with Duke at LSU and at Free Speech Alley. And both of us, Christopher, are really kind of trained as historians, and I think just kind of geek out on this stuff. And I think a really important thing that I learned, and that I think is important for people to understand, is just, like, what the context was of kind of free speech and the conversation about free speech in America in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was in a very different place than we're at right now. And it was in a place where, like, the normative opinion from, like, left wing liberal people, I think, was you have to let somebody like David Duke speak. And if you restrict the speech of even somebody whose speech you find totally abhorrent, then that's actually illiberal, and that's a terrible thing. And so I think that's kind of an important context of those early Duke years. Do you agree with that take, and sort of how do you think about those questions now that we're in like a pretty
Mhm.
different place in 2020 than we were in 1969, 1970?
I mean, I do agree with that take. And, in thinking about, I don't know, I tend to adopt the line when it comes to even extreme forms of speech that I'd rather know where someone stands. And I guess that there's two parts to this. One is knowing where someone stands and then allowing them to proselytize and spread their messages of hate and dissent and what have you. Um, but I guess I feel as if, and we've talked about my cynicism before, but I guess I feel like David Duke, these ideas didn't start with him. They're going to be strong, I imagine, once he's gone. Um, and so silencing him or someone else like him is not necessarily going to end the kind of perpetuation of the ideas that he espouses. So I don't know if that's the place to focus our energy, is to try to get him to sort of stop people like him from saying and putting his ideas out there. Um, I think it's a matter of, in some ways, I think it's a matter of like accepting what America is, as a space where these ideas are part of the foundation of this country, and actually wrestling with those ideas rather than pushing for silencing people, if that makes sense. That's my side
Yeah.
on that stuff.
So how does that stand? And I'll let you ask me a question after this.
Sure.
You can be out of the spotlight. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
how do you kind of how does what you just said jibe with our decision not to interview Duke then?
Well, as you say, and I think that you addressed it really cleanly and elegantly. We didn't linger on our decision, which was, you led the charge, and that's kind of behind the scenes look. And this is a wonderful opportunity to give a shout out to our team. I'm not dodging your question, but it is a good time to give a shout out to our team. What you all see here is me and Josh, but we have a phenomenal, small but rock solid team of editors and producers behind Slow Burn. You hear their names in the credits all the time. And so together, we processed all these ideas, including whether or not we were going to approach Duke or not. And I think that the way that you laid it out, which is that he he has not essentially changed or shifted his position. Um, he he has said that and you see this in the course of our series, said that he has changed, but from the way that he's lived his life, it does not seem that his message changed, or certainly not in the arc of time that we're covering in the series. And so, inviting him on, it's not clear that having him on our show, on our series, would add or change. We would be doing it as part of a kind of journalistic protocol. But part of that journalism is also considering the reasons why we would give someone our air as such. And so I think that I would have raised my hand if I felt differently, but I think that we made the right call. I think we had so much David Duke tape of him laying out where he stands, with people confronting him and saying, here's a chance for you to shift that message. And he didn't. He bobbed and weaved, but it remained pretty consistent. And so I don't see that it would have been any different for us. And so why go through that? That's how I feel, and I think that you were right in laying it out like that.
Yeah.
How do you feel? I mean, I think I can guess the answer to this, but now that we've had a chance to catch our breath, the season is over. Have you thought any more about it? Do you feel any differently about the decision?
I think it was and is a hard thing to think about. I mean, the reason that I was interested in doing this series is because I think it's important, but also challenging. to think about how to confront and present these ideas. And so I, when I laid it out in the episode of our series, I didn't want to make it seem like I was being, pronouncing from a mountaintop and saying that this is the right call for everyone. And like I was, the Pointer Institute, kind of, telling everybody how to go about their business if they were going through, their own process of deciding how to make these calls. But I think the important factors for me were then and remain now. As you said, we know where he stands. There's no possibility. I was 100% convinced that there was no possibility that we would learn anything new from an interview with Duke. And if I thought differently, then I think I would have proceeded differently. He's also somebody who is confirmed over decades to be a liar, and that's kind of his stock in trade. And then separately, there's this question of platforming and what would we gain? What would our listeners gain from giving him this platform, and what would he gain? And I feel like our ability as journalists to tell this story, to present his side of the story, as well as ours, was not at all encumbered by a lack of an interview with him done today.
Right.
And that in fact, doing an interview with him today would be counterproductive
Right.
in a bunch of different ways. So when I lay all that out, it's not to say that it's like the easiest decision I've ever made in my life, but that's just like how it all came down for me.
Okay. I want to ask you another question, and this comes from fans of the show, people who listen to the show, and it's about Donald Trump. I want to talk about the decision to not mention Trump very much at all in the series. What was the thinking behind that, behind not explicitly naming Trump, since, as many people have said, the parallels feel present for a lot of people in listening to this?
Yeah, so it would be, I don't want to insult people's intelligence and say that we weren't thinking about Trump at all. I mean, look, in the intro in episode 4, as we kind of, as we kind of bumped the theme music by David Gross, shout out to David, as we bumped the theme music after our cold open for all these episodes, we want it to be a moment that hits really hard, right? Christopher, we want it to be something that's like gives you chills, or it's like makes you want to keep listening. In
Mm-hmm.
episode 4, we have this moment from a speech where Duke talks about how he wants to make America great again. I don't know if it was exactly that, but he says like at least 3 of those 4 words. He says essentially "make America great again,"
Mm-hmm.
and we're thinking as we're cutting the show together that sounds like something that sounds like the thing that Donald Trump says. We're expecting our audience to be thinking that's the thing that Donald Trump says. And so there's some moments in the show where obviously we're conscious of it. But the thing that I wanted people to take away from this is not, oh, this guy is just like Trump and it's the blueprint for Trump. And look, some people are going to take that away. I don't think they're necessarily wrong, but it gets back to what you were saying right in the beginning of this conversation, Christopher. It's that this kind of messaging and packaging predated David Duke. It's going to be here long after Donald Trump is gone. It's a story about America. It's about this country and how racism sells, how it's sold, why it sells,
Mm-hmm.
who sold it, and who will continue to sell it. And so I think it's a story that's bigger than David Duke, and it's a story that's bigger than Donald Trump. And the fact that it resonates with people now, because of the world we're living in now, might make the story seem more powerful, which is a great thing. I'm glad that, I'm sad that it feels resonant now, but I'm also glad that we're making something that feels like it's in conversation with what's going on today. But I don't want, so I guess that's all like a long way around of saying I don't want to mention Trump because I don't want people to think the show is about Trump.
Right.
But also, there's a more kind of practical reason, which is that President Donald Trump doesn't exist in the universe of our show.
Exactly. Exactly.
We're,
Exactly.
we're telling, in one episode we go back to the '70s and talk about Duke and the Klan, and then most of the rest of the show, the present tense is in 85, 86, 88, 89, 90, 91. And so am I going to step out of that time frame and be like, yeah, just like Donald Trump, get it? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense given the kind of show that we are. And so it feels kind of overdetermined, I guess, that we weren't going to talk about Trump. Is there anything else that you have thought about with the Trump question or would add to that?
No, I mean, I agree 1,000%. I will, I'll admit that when this season started, I sat down, I had coffee right before Slate locked the offices down. I got it, slipped in a coffee with our editor, one of our editors, Lo and Lou. And I talked to him about this. And my background is in radio reporting. And I asked him what he thought about, we didn't have we hadn't done scripts or anything like that. And I was just asking him what he thought about the idea of making this parallel explicit.
Yeah.
And he said to me basically what, you just laid out, which is that it will be, first of all, if listeners want to draw those conclusions, then they will draw them and there will be no need to like draw it out for them. The other thing, of course, is that, as you said, he doesn't exist in the same way that he does now in this universe. And I also think that the kind of added thing, now I've produced 2 seasons of Slow Burn, and one of the things that folks don't necessarily get to see is just how tightly edited and scripted the show really is. And I think that that's the thing that really makes the show really work, is that our lines are really sharp and hard and clear. Doesn't mean that they're always easy to stay inside of, but they're so clear, and in some ways it's freeing, and it's that discipline of like, we're staying in this lane. We have plenty to cover and plenty of tape to go through and plenty of interviews to do just inside of the world that we've defined that's going to be this season. And everything else that's outside of it and connections that folks draw, that's fine. So some of it is also just the way that it's a sort of slow burn way.
Yeah, I think the risk that you run is that the audience perceives it like you're being coy,
That's
and
true.
that people think you're like winking at them the whole time that you're making the show, which we're not. But I can understand why people would come away with that idea. But what I will say is like, so Laura Miller, Slate's book critic, who's a genius, um, you know, a student of all things literary, and just a masterful kind of interpreter of any kind of text. I was talking to her when I was working on my book about the welfare queen myth, and the woman behind it. She said something to me that really was smart and has stuck with me in that, and on the other work that I've done, which is that whether it's a reader or a listener, they don't really care about you giving them the answer. They just want to kind of play along and follow along. And whether if it's like literally a detective story, they want to play the detective. They don't want to necessarily be told, "Here's who did it" right away. It's a kind of you're doing this kind of like dance, and people want to make those connections. It makes it feel. I think it makes you feel smarter as a listener if you're kind of making connections yourself. It makes you feel more engaged with the story and the storytelling if it feels like you're kind of helping to fill in the blanks. And people are, if people think that they are coming to a conclusion themselves rather than being told what to think, then that answer or the conclusion or the connection is going to feel stronger. And so that, especially, and I think we're both drawn to this kind of journalism where the answers aren't necessarily easy or obvious or clear, the kind of murky and complicated. And so, again, it feels kind of overdetermined to me. Like, I don't want to be telling people what to think or how to think. And I also feel like that can make for a stronger listening or reading experience
Yeah.
if people are able to kind of come to their own conclusions.
Okay. Okay.
Question from somebody who's watching live. Live feedback, Christopher.
All
Mike
right.
Bauer wants to know, what was the hardest or worst part of making this season?
Ooh, you want me to take that first?
Yeah, go for it.
That's an easy one, I think. Anyway, not being able to be out in the field. Um, I mean, there were many challenging things about making this season, but one of them was, and for me, one of the biggest is not being able to go out into the world and interview people, to sit with them, and we got some wonderful tape, and we had dozens, more than dozens of people who um, let us walk them through how to record themselves. Were very patient with us. We have a wonderful production assistant, Madeline Ducharme, who is just, a Swiss Army knife of talent and skill. And one of the things that she did was walk our guests through recording themselves and uploading and sending files and all that great stuff. And so people were very patient with us in doing that, and we're grateful for that. But to me, nothing beats when you can be able to sit in someone's, living room or in their front yard or in their office or whatever, and talk to them face to face. And I don't feel like the season lacked for not having that, but it's also for me just one of the joys of the work is being able to get out and
Yeah.
meet people.
Well, in season three, you and Joel went to Vegas together. And I remember
Yes,
talking,
to
because
do
I worked with,
interviews.
yeah, yeah. Well, partly. But I remember, as part of the team on that show, as an editor on it, um, hearing about that trip and the interviews you did. But also, that was an opportunity for you guys to like be in a car together and like
Yeah.
kind of talk about whatever, life, but also like what you wanted that season to be. And it's like, whether it's with colleagues or whether you're doing these interviews in person, you can't replace those sorts of experiences when you're like connecting the conversation with a place, and a moment. All of the conversations. I'm not trying to like rag on our season. It was a great season. Maybe the greatest season of any show that's ever been made. No,
That's
but
possible.
uh, but all of the conversations that we had for the show, I was just standing in the same place in my closet in front of my computer, and so I will always remember the kind of Edwin Edwards, Trina Edwards conversation, and having Trina relay my questions to her 92-year-old husband. And I remember that because talking to Edwin Edwards was just something that is just like, how could you forget that? But that was also different. Like it was, um, you know, it, in a kind of set of experiences that were like similar in a lot of different ways from a technical standpoint and from like a geographic standpoint. That was an experience that was unique, like talking to her and having her talk to him. So, and you kind of like latch onto to that stuff, and that's a thing that I'll always remember from this season.
And how about you? What was another thing that was hard or challenging about making this?
I think just dealing with all the material
Hmm.
that we had, and I think once we made the decision about not focusing on Duke the person and more focusing on the ideas and how and why they spread, uh, that to me felt like kind of as a North Star for the series. That was really useful. But you have these two really competing, um, things as you're putting together a real long form project like this, which is that you want to tell a full and complete story that doesn't distort anything. And we have just a rare opportunity to have this enormous blank canvas to tell a story, any story that we want, basically. Um, and yet we just have way too much material, even with the size of the canvas that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you condense it down without, it's like when you have an enormous like JPEG file and you're like, all right, I want to like, crop it down, but you don't want to you don't want to get rid of any of the detail. You don't want to distort it so it's like too wide and not high enough. So you just feel like you're constantly having to make decisions that are potentially the wrong ones. Can I leave out this person's story? Can I elide this fact? Can I, leave out everything that Duke did between the years 1981 and 1986, and still feel like I'm not shortchanging the listener, and not giving an inaccurate portrayal of what this thing was? And that was
Mm-hmm.
just constantly the battle,
Mm-hmm.
and that for me is kind of the challenge. And I would be lying if I said there was the fun part of it, but I think it's rewarding to feel like, to look at the end and see all of the raw material that we had
Yeah.
and what we made out of it. It feels good.
I know we're really short on time, but I have to ask this question um, just really quickly because you were talking a little bit about your process, and this is actually something that I actually don't know the answer to. Um, what is your writing process? To the extent that you have one, I don't know, but what is, considering how much material we really did have, so much audio coming in, you're reading stacks of books, watching films, doing logistics and all that kind of stuff. How, at the end of the day, did you sit down and start writing? Like, what was your process? Briefly.
So I would do it right here where I'm sitting now. I just closed the blinds because we're getting to the magic hour here in DC. Glare was attacking me. I have to have all the windows closed. I don't like to be back in the day when we used to be able to go to cafes and stuff like that. Not a big cafe person. I like to be in a very controlled environment where I like have my screens. I have the desk set up. I have the books and my papers exactly where I know they are. I don't want ambient noise. I don't want stuff bothering me. So that's part of it. I'm a very linear thinker, and I have a very hard time. Sometimes you'll see very accomplished writers and people who I respect ask for writing advice, be like, oh, well, if you're not inspired to write the introduction, just skip ahead and write a scene that, you do feel motivated to do. Like if there's something in, towards the end of the story and you like know what the beginning and the end of that kind of set piece is going to be, just go ahead and write that. I can't do that. I want to know what comes before and what comes after, because that's the whole game, is making connections. And if I don't know what came before,
Right.
then how do I know what the listener knows? I mean, I think in some ways it's a failure of imagination,
Mm-hmm.
and some ways it's stubbornness, but, and I wouldn't say it necessarily works for me. I'd just say that that's how I do it. And, you know, the advantage is that I think first draft is probably stronger, but it just takes longer to get there,
Mm-hmm.
because if you get stuck, um, then there's no way around the hole. Then
Right.
you just got to fill the hole or
Right.
drive right through it. I don't know
Right.
what the analogy is there, but it's like you risk hitting, pretty big bumps, and like not being able to start is a major hazard. Like, um, if you know how the beginning, what you want the beginning to be,
Mhm.
then you're in a much better place than if you're kind of lost and clueless. And I would just say, if this is useful in answering the question, the episode that was much, by far the easiest for me to write was episode 3 about Beth Rickey and Anne Levy. Even though there was some stuff changed in the editing process, it was an episode that was focused on these two women. Their stories were um, uh, told pretty chronologically. There were various events that happened that were going to hit in very specific places. And I just felt there are no structural questions or issues here. I know what I want to, what material I want to include. And so that was pretty straightforward. And the most challenging one for me to write, and I was really, it felt great with how it ended up, was episode 4, which, as you know, Christopher, we were just kind of bedeviled by how to open that episode because I knew that I wanted to do something on iconography of Duke campaigns and what those signs meant, and all that stuff, but I just didn't really know what the way in was. And so, as you can probably imagine, given the explanation that I just gave, it's really hard for me to get sink my teeth into that episode, kind of knowing the 30,000 foot version, but not knowing the like zoomed in one.
Okay.
All right. Friend of mine, Marcel Guerin, wants to know where you got that shirt, Christopher.
I'm not telling. I'm not
All
giving
right.
it up.
Um,
I bought it somewhere in
another,
Brooklyn.
another question from Marcel. Um, Even though Duke lost the governor's race in 1991, do you, Christopher Johnson, think that he accomplished his goal or felt like he accomplished his goal?
Um, yes, in the sense that I mean, he says, the message is out there, even if I didn't, even if I didn't win, the message is out there, and you know, well, so it depends. Like he says decades earlier that his goal is to kind of be the essentially the savior of the white race in America. So I don't know that he accomplished that goal, but he did accomplish some goals, and among them, I think, were kind of keeping his ideas alive and proving that there was substantial support for the way that he thinks and feels. Substantial voting support, like people who will actually show up and use their vote to keep it alive.
Um, Enjoy the siren behind me if you can hear it. He proved that he won his base, right? Like he won white voters in Louisiana. And so I think he was making an argument for decades that he was the messenger for this kind of ideology of, based around white grievance and white supremacy. And I think he could rightfully say that he was vindicated by the results in Louisiana in 1990 and 1991. It pains me to say that, but if the demographics of the state were different, if there were fewer black people in Louisiana, if fewer black people had voted, then the results would have been different. And there's just been a lot of kind of confusion, I think, and speculation about why Duke didn't run for Congress from the New Orleans suburbs, the you know district that would have had a similar composition to District 81, where he won the state house race in 1989. He did eventually run in that district in 1999, I believe. But if instead of running for president in 1992, if he had turned around and run for Congress, then we could have had a United States representative, David Duke, potentially. But I think his ego at that point was too big, and he just had this vision for himself that he was going to be the president of the United States. So that's that.
I have two more questions. We're going to try to squeeze them in, Josh. One is, has David Duke or any of his intermediaries or his people reached out to us about the podcast at this point?
Nope, not to my knowledge. No, I mean,
Same.
I guess it would have to be to my knowledge, but no, I can't say that they have.
Okay. And then the last question is, sorry, folks, we got a lot of really great questions and time just flew by. Sorry. So, Josh, question for you.
Most of the questions are about Christopher's shirt, but
so we're just ticking through those. Were you, and I'm curious also about the answer to this, were you worried about being a white person telling this story?
yeah, I think honestly, I felt like that was a reason to do it, though, not a reason not to do it, because I feel like we can't, as journalists or as a society, rely on Black journalists or journalists of color to tell every story about race. Like, I think these are stories that everyone, it's all of our responsibilities to tell these stories thoughtfully and sensitively. And I am drawn to stories that make me uncomfortable and that make other people uncomfortable. And, there's a way in which I can sort of, I don't know if stand above it is the right term, but like as a Jewish person, um, I can look at David Duke and say, he was a threat to me and people like me. But, also as a white person, I think I can and should think about the ways in which I'm implicated in stories about race and anti-Blackness. And so that was also kind of interesting to me and kind of positioning myself as the narrator in this story. And, it gets back to a question that a lot of people raised before we started doing the series and when it was announced, which is, why are you giving this series attention? Why are you giving this guy attention? And so that's something that I was conscious of. I feel like we've sort of answered that question in a bunch of different ways just because we feel like this is a current in American society that's been around in the past, it's here in the present, and will be in the future. And rather than looking away from it, I think we need to look directly at it. But I understand why some people would say, this isn't for me. I understand why people would ask the question, why are you doing this? And I hope that our season, 6 episodes plus, and episodes for Slate Plus members, shout out to Slate Plus members. I hope that the season is an answer to that question. And if you listen to it, you'll come away feeling like through our work, we answered that in a satisfactory way. At least I hope so.
Yes.
Any final thoughts from you, Christopher?
Listen, I have said this many times to you and to other people, but this was an intense process and incredibly exciting and fulfilling, and I'm honored to have done it with you, man. Like, it's been great and enlightening, and I think that we're at a different place just a month or so later, in many ways in this country, but we were making this, as the protests were really, really intensifying around the country.
Yeah.
And so making this in the middle of that, and of course, coronavirus and all of that, I'm super proud of what we did, and really grateful grateful that I got to make it with you, man.
Likewise, it's been a privilege to work on this with you and with all of our team at
Yeah.
Slate. And just want to say a couple things before we sign off, which is thank you so much to our Slate Plus members for making this work possible. And again, if you are a member or if you're interested, there is all this bonus material. If you like this conversation that we had today, Christopher and I, in conversation with our colleague Chow Tu, spoke throughout the season about our process and the decisions that we made. And there's a whole kind of catalog of these Slate Plus episodes that you can listen to as a companion to the series. And then also just this is a part of an ongoing series for Slate Live, our Wednesday night series. So we're happy and proud to be a part of that. And we're doing another one of these next Wednesday. Chris Melanthi of Hit Parade, one of the classic podcasts in any genre. He'll be hosting a music trivia show. Different vibe next
Mhm.
week, but I love Chris. I love his show, and that'll be a great time. So thank you, Christopher. Thank you to all of you guys. It's been fun.
I want to give a real quick shout out because we're big on credits and I very much believe in them. Just a really quick shout out to our editorial team, Gabe Roth, Lowen Lute, our producers, Sophie Summergrad, Melanie Ducharme, and we can't forget our crew at Slate Live, Faith and Britt. And so, yeah, thank you.
Here, here.